Thank you. Hey, everyone, I'm Janet B. I've recovered from compulsive eating and bulimia, and I am happy to be here talking about step two. So this is part three of our step two workshop. Um, Melissa talked last week about a deep dive into what is a spiritual experience, right? I wasn't here. That was it, right? Okay. And then the week before, we did the first half of chapter four, We Agnostics. So we talked about basically why we need to find a power greater than ourselves, that this power is God as we understand God, not doorknob, not group, but God, right? That's right on page 46. And then we talked about some of the things that can block us from God. We talked about prejudices. So some of the prejudices that we can have and that they tell us to look at, or maybe the concept we were given about God as a child doesn't work for us. Maybe bad things that have happened block us from God. Maybe we think, oh, people who say they believe in God aren't very nice, so that blocks us. So the book encourages us to look at our prejudices. And so now we are going to pick up on I'm going to pick up on page 52, where it talks about the problems that we have in addition to compulsive eating. So it's interesting. They didn't just say, step one, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And then on to step two, they said our lives were unmanageable. Well, what is an unmanageable life? And they talk about it on page 52. It says, we were having trouble with our personal relationships, couldn't control our emotional natures, a prey to misery and depression, couldn't make a living, feeling of uselessness, full of fear, unhappy, couldn't help other people. And they say, wasn't a basic solution of these bedevilments. What an interesting word. Bedevilments, more important, right? Wasn't that important? So what's the definition of a bedevilment? I didn't make this up. You guys can look it up in the dictionary. To be controlled as if by devils. So they're saying it's like we're powerless over these things the same way that we're powerless over food. And so they say we need a solution to this. And the solution that this program talks about is a relationship, not a drug, but a relationship with a loving God. And again, remember, they're talking to agnostics. So they continue and say, bottom of 52, when we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. And then they go on and they say, the Wright brothers' almost childish faith that they could build a machine which would fly was the mainspring of their accomplishments. Without that, nothing could have happened. Okay, so they're telling us to look at two groups of people. The first group, alcoholics, who solved their drinking problem by a simple reliance on God. What does it mean to rely on God, right? Like practically, what does that mean? It means we do what we think He would have us do and leave the outcome in His hands. We do the right thing and leave the outcome in His hands, trusting that whatever happens, it's going to be for the best. That's a way to rely on God. I've talked about it recently. I've had a little bit of, minor health things yesterday, but they were minor or recently minor, but annoying, nothing that's going to kill me, but stuff that gets me where I really can't get out of bed, where I'm just kind of incapacitated for the day. And how do I solve that problem? Well, yes, I call the doctor. But what does a simple reliance upon God look like in those situations when we have health problems or marriage problems or problems with our kids? It means that we just, instead of just praying for what we want, which, yes, we do that, we surrender it. We give it to God. So my relying on God with my health just meant, God, I'm going to do what I think you want me to as far as the doctors, the treatment, whatever. And then I'm just going to rely on you that you're going to give me the health and the body that you need for me to have to do your will. And that's it. So one is we looked at others and we see all these people who rely on God They stopped binging. So that's okay. That's one group of people they tell us to look at. Then they tell us to look at the Wright brothers. Okay, these are two brothers who built an airplane, I don't know, a lot of years ago. I should know. I've moved to North Carolina. There's actually a Wright brothers museum here, and we were right near it over the summer. So they built the first airplane. And they say, what was the mainspring of their accomplishment? Their mathematical abilities, their knowledge of physics? They say their almost childish faith. It's like they believed they could do it, and that kind of did something. Okay, that sounds really weird, but that is because in America, in this world, things are transactional. And usually the way we get things we need is money or a credit card, which represents money, right? If I go to the store and I want a bag of groceries, or I go to the gas station and I want to fill up my car, I hand the clerk either, $20 bill or a credit card. Why? Because money is the currency in the physical world, right? All over the globe. Well, I can't hand God my American Express card and say, please help me, because money is not the currency in the spiritual world. Faith is. Just like money helps me get things in the physical world, faith is a catalyst in the spiritual world, right? If you think about step two, it's just such an odd step. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I mean, if I had bronchitis, I don't need to come to believe that penicillin can restore me to sanity. If someone gives me the penicillin and I don't even know what it is, I'll get better. I don't need to believe it. But this is at root a spiritual illness, right? Chapter 5 says once the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. So we've got to learn kind of the spiritual currency. And faith, generally activated by prayer, is the spiritual currency. So coming to believe that we can do something actually does something in the spiritual world. Now, I don't know, but I mean, here's one scenario that I can imagine, that God is up there in the heavenlies with his team. I picture these like little angels with, little mini hard hats and mini, tool belts on. And God hears a prayer saying like, God, I need help. And maybe it's someone who never even turned to God before, but it's like, God, I need help. Can you help me? And he grabs a team of angels and he says, our next search and rescue mission, it's going to be for her. Faith is the currency in the spiritual world. Believing actually makes things happen in the spiritual world. So page 53, they continue on and they say, when we became alcoholics or compulsive eaters, crushed, right? This illness crushes us by a self-imposed crisis we couldn't postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition, either God is everything or else he is nothing. He either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? Okay, when they say God is everything or else he is nothing, I don't think, I can imagine myself when I first came around and I was a real smart aleck and I'm like, okay, well, is God this pen? Is God my cell phone? Guys, that's not what they mean. They don't mean God is your pen. What they mean is either we give God everything or it's if we give God nothing. I can't give him my food, but cheat on my taxes. God has to get everything. And they say, what was our choice to be? We get to choose God. We get to choose whether or not we're going to believe in God. And they're still, again, remember they're talking to the agnostic, page 53. Without knowing it, had we not been brought to where we stood by a certain kind of faith. And again, the dictionary definition of faith is a belief that is not based on proof. I mean, we have that all the time, right? They say we believe in our own reasoning, right? I think if I think something, okay, it must be true. And says we've been faithful to the God of reason, page 54. And they say, and we've also been worshipers. And worship means adoring, reverence, respect, and awe. So it's like we're hardwired to have faith in something. and we're hardwired to worship. And then it tells us that what we've worshiped. It says, page 54, had we not variously worshiped people, sentiment, money, and ourselves, right? So people, other people, sentiment, just like the sappy idea of love. Like when I was in high school, I used to write this poetry about this boy who I had a crush on who didn't have a crush on me, how we looked at the same moon every night. And I thought I was like such a great poet and so deep. I mean, I was a 16-year-old, worshiped sentiment, right? Things, money, and ourselves. Notice what isn't on this list. Alcohol is not on this list, or food is not on this list. Sometimes people say, well, I make an idol, I make a god out of food. And I'm like, that is not true. We make an idol, we worship ourselves. And as a result, food comes in by default. We're not safe and protected when we're worshiping ourselves. But we don't sit around and worship food. That's just the inevitable consequence of worshiping things other than God. And they say, again, they say it's impossible to say we have no capacity for faith or love or worship. In one form or another, we've been living by faith and little else. And they talk about we've all worshipfully beheld the flowers, the sea, a sunset. We are hardwired to worship, and it's important to worship. I think it's important to start our time with God with worship, not a list of gimme, 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 but just worshiping, like praising him for who he is. We are hardwired to worship. If we don't worship God, we're going to worship someone else or something else. Page 55, they finish talking about the Wright brothers, and they say, after talking about their flight, we've seen another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world, people who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible, and we, the agnostics, only smiled. We had seen spiritual relief, but liked to tell themselves it wasn't true. Okay, first, why would they want to tell themselves it wasn't true? If they're sitting there, right, alcoholics, unable to stop drinking, and they see a bunch of people who aren't drinking anymore, who are happy, joyous, and free, and say God did it, why wouldn't they do it? And here's why. I know for myself, sometimes I'd rather be right than get healed, right? Sometimes we just want to be right, even if it means we're going to stay sick. And so what are they telling us we can do? If we don't believe in God, there's certain things we can do. We can look at, okay, God has taken these 13 people I know who believe in him and relied on him and restored them to sanity. Maybe there's something to it. We can start looking at the evidence. And then they tell us, after we like to tell ourselves there is no God, page 55, the most beautiful line in the book, in my opinion. Actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. That speaks to me because what that says is that when God created me and he gave me one heart, two lungs, two kidneys, and in there he planted the fundamental idea of himself. That God loves us so much that when he created us, he put the idea of himself right in there, right in our souls. And it says, but it may be obscured, so it may be blocked by three things: calamity, pomp, and worship of other things. Calamity, bad things happen. They happen to us, they happen in the world, and we may look at it and say, I can't believe in a God who allows this. By pomp, that's worship of myself. I want everything I want. And if I believe in God and I turn to God, I may not be allowed to do things like cheat on my taxes anymore. Or worship of other things, other people, how our kids are doing, whether we're going to get married, all this stuff, worship of other things. They say it obscures it, but in some form or other, it is there because God put it there. It says faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. So they say, okay, it's not just faith, a belief, but what we get with this is a miraculous demonstration. So I'm going to challenge anyone here who doesn't believe in God and who hasn't been willing to believe in God. I'm going to say this. Why don't you try for 30 days to make a decision to believe that there's a God and do everything that you think that God would have you do if in fact he existed? Just an experiment of faith, right? To just see, okay, and start talking to this God and praying to this God. And you may feel weird, like, okay, God, I don't know if you're listening, but if you're listening, I'm a little nervous about this work project I have today. Or, okay, if you're listening, you probably have someone you want me to help. So please put someone you want me to help in my path. Okay, if you're there, I'm thinking about food a little too much. Can you please remove this food obsession and instead guide me to someone I can help? And I would challenge someone, try it for 30 days. And if you're not happier, go back to not believing in God. But the point is, we can make a decision to believe, right? We can make a decision. I've heard all about this king in England, right? I've seen him on the TV, read about him in magazines, but I've never been to England. I've never seen him. For all I know, it's like some big hoax that People magazine, is cooking up for some reason. But I choose to believe there's a king in England, totally irrelevant to my life. But I look at the evidence and I believe it. So they're saying we can look at the evidence. If nothing else, look at all the other people who recovered and start with that. And so they say, okay, we finally saw faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup. It's in there. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly. Okay, how do we search fearlessly? We look at our prejudices. We look at our spiritual cataracts. We look at our idols. We look at the reasons why we don't want to believe in God. Because if we don't, we probably don't want to. And there's a reason. And it may be, if I believe in God, I can't do what I want. I can't keep living on self-will. They say God is as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. And they say we can only clear the ground a bit, right? They want us to seek. They tell us to sweep away prejudice, think honestly, and search diligently. And then page 56, they go ahead and they tell the story of the minister's son. And I love this story. So perfect example of someone who gets a miracle and quickly. Guys, it doesn't have to take 6 months to get a miracle. It can be like super quick. So here's our guy. He's a minister's son, and he ends up in an insane asylum because of his alcoholism. There was, if you look at the first paragraph on 56 and you tease it out, you could see he had pride. There was calamity in his life. He had resentment. And here he is, mental and physical collapse to the point of self-destruction. And he's in a hospital and he's approached by another alcoholic. And, we all have read that says, he says, if there is a God, he hasn't done anything for me. And I like to turn to the actual story. The story is our Southern friend on page 208 in the big book. It's a great story, but I'm going to pick it up on page 214, where when he goes to the guy, another alcoholic who's in the same insane asylum, and he talks to him. And he says he goes to the guy and the guy says, "You think you're hopeless, don't you?" And the minister's son says, "I know I am," page 214. "Well, you're not," says the man. "There are men on the streets of New York today who were worse than you, and they don't drink anymore." Then he asked, so again, first he said, "Do you think you're hopeless?" And he said, "I know it." So he had a first step. But is he willing to go to any lengths yet, right? Because a first step without a willingness to go to any lengths will get us nowhere. It'll just get us sad, but it won't get us anywhere. So we're not sure if he's willing to go to any lengths yet. So the man says to him, he asked he asked the minister's son, he said, do you believe in a power greater than yourself, whatever you call that power? I told him I believe in electricity, but as for God, if there is one, he's never done anything for me, right? That's electricity is not a God. Electricity cannot restore me to sanity. So here he is. And then the man says, are you willing to right all your wrongs you've ever done, no matter how wrong you thought the others were? Are you willing to be honest with yourself and tell someone about yourself? Are you willing to think of other people and of their needs instead of your own in order to get rid of the drink problem? And he says, I'll do anything. So he has step one. He has a willingness to go to any lengths yet, but he doesn't have step two yet. So he's still nowhere. The man says, well, then all your troubles are done. Remember, he's willing, doesn't have step two, but a beautiful saying I've heard, willingness opens the door to grace. So the guy just leaves and he says, but he can't sleep. So suddenly a thought comes. Okay, when we read this, suddenly a thought comes. I always want to say, where'd the thought come from? Right? Remember, this guy's willing, and willingness opens the door to grace. And here's the thought. Can all the worthwhile people I have known be wrong about God? So suddenly he's open-minded. And he says, I start thinking about myself and a few things I wanted to forget. I begin to see I'm not the person I had thought myself. I had judged myself comparing myself to others and always to my own advantage. It is a shock. So again, willing, and God's starting to do some work. And then comes another thought that he says is like a voice. Who are you to say there is no God? He says, it rings in my head. So he gets out of bed again. Imagine this. You're an alcoholic detoxing in an asylum. You have a talk with someone. You go to your bed, you go to sleep. Something's got to be pretty powerful to get you out of your bed, put your robe on, go back down the hall to that other guy and go in and say, I must ask you a question. How does prayer fit into this thing? Okay, here's a guy who didn't believe in God. And now, half an hour later, he's asking about prayer. And this is what the man says. Well, you've probably tried praying like I have. When you've been in a jam, you've said, God, please do this or that. And if it turned out your way, that was the last of it. And if it didn't, you said, there isn't any God, or he doesn't do anything for me. Is that right? Yes, says the minister's son. That isn't the way, his friend continued. The thing I do is to say, God, here I am, and here are all my troubles. I've made a mess of things and can't do anything about it. You take me and all my troubles and do anything you want with me. Okay, that's surrender. So he said to the minister's son, does that answer your question? And this is what he says. Yes, it does. And he leaves. He returns to bed. And this is what he says. It doesn't make sense. Suddenly, I feel a wave of utter hopelessness sweep over me. I am in the bottom of hell, and there a tremendous hope is born. It might be true. I tumble out of bed onto my knees. I know not what I say, but slowly a great peace comes to me. I feel lifted up. I believe in God. I crawl back into bed and sleep like a child. And he never drinks again. That all happened in one night, admitting he was hopeless, willing to go to any lengths, willing to believe in God, and God more than met him halfway. It's like he went 1% and God went 99. And back on page 56, it talks about the result of this. It says, he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God, not just a belief in God, but the reality of God with him. It said it poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. Barriers he built the barriers through the years, were swept away. So he built the barriers, but God swept them away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and love, right? That's God, infinite power and love. For the first time, but not the last time, He lived in conscious companionship with his creator. Then it says his alcoholic problem was taken away. It was removed, right? Because that's the only way we get recovered and stay recovered. God removes the food problem. It says that very night years ago, it disappeared. It's just like gone. Save for a few brief moments of temptation, the thought of drink has never returned. And at such times, a great revulsion has risen up in him. God restored his sanity. What does it mean to be restored to sanity? So they talk about that on page 84 of the book. And this is a promise for after we finish the 9th step. It says, we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, or for us food. For by this time after we finish the 9th step, sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor or food not on our food plan. If tempted, we recoil from it as if from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally. This has happened automatically. Our new attitude toward liquor or food has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes. That is the miracle of it. Okay, so being restored to sanity, they're saying, is a miracle, a gift from God. Well, then how do we do it? Like, does God just flip a coin and like heads, I'll give Janet this gift of recovery, tails, I won't? No. Page 57, it says, what is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. So they're telling us that there's basically a recipe for a miracle. Circumstances made him willing to believe, right? He took a first step, willing to go to any lengths, willing to believe in God. He humbly offered himself to his maker, humbly offered himself to God. Then he knew. And they close the chapter by saying, even so has God restored us all, 100% of us, to our right minds, right? Because once the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. To this man, the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly, but he has come to all who have honestly sought him. And they say, when we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. So I just want to talk about one more thing that is the close to step 2, the ABCs, and it says, once we believe that, we're ready to start step 3. So if we go to page 60, and I think when we're sponsoring people, this is really important to just go through these ABCs really carefully, because if that's not there, there's not a foundation, and then the whole spiritual structure is going to be wobbling. So they say our description of the alcoholic, compulsive eater, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic, compulsive eaters, and could not manage our own lives. So again, if someone is toward the end of step 2 and doesn't believe she's a compulsive eater and can't manage her own life, need to go back and work on step 1. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, compulsive eating. That means no sponsor, no group, no therapist, no human power could relieve our compulsive eating. So most of us get through A and B really easily. It's C where we get tripped up. That came to believe, right? That God could and would if he were sought. So let's break that down. This is what I would do. I would start by asking someone, do you believe that God could restore other people to sanity? And generally, he or she will say yes, because we've seen other people restored to sanity. So do you believe God could restore other people to sanity? Yes. Do you believe God could restore you to sanity if he wanted to? He may not want to, but could he if he wanted to? And then generally someone would say, well, yes, he's God. He could do whatever he wants. Of course he could if he wanted to. And then it's, do you believe he will if you seek him? And this is where people sometimes struggle. They believe he could, that he's done it for others, but he won't for me. And here are some of the reasons people give. I've tried this so many times before and it hasn't worked. I caused this. If it was something like cancer that I didn't cause, I could ask them for help, but I caused this, so I have no right to ask for help. Um, I'm drawing a blank spot that I can't remember my other reasons. I've tried it, it hasn't worked. I caused it. I can't remember. Melissa, you remember? There's three other reasons.
Yeah, one is that I'm not worthy. I've done something wrong.
Oh, okay, got it.
Done
So
something wrong. I'm not
right,
worthy.
right, right. Okay, thank you. That I've done this really horrible thing or done some horrible things. The other is just like, I'm not worthy, not because of something I've done, just this like feeling of shame. And the other is like, I'm not willing to do the work. Well, to that person, I would say, you're right, because this program requires that we seek him. So if you're not willing to do the work, you're right. You have no right to expect God to restore you to sanity. But let's take the person who says, well, I've tried it so many times and it hasn't worked. And I would say, like, okay, I can pick up my cell phone and it's true. I try to take a picture 100 times by pushing the on off button, nothing happens. But then someone comes along, probably one of my kids and says, Mom, you're pushing the wrong button. And suddenly I can take pictures. It doesn't matter if I've done it wrong 100 times before. And sometimes someone will say to me, but I've really worked the steps before. And I'll say, were you rigorously honest while you were working the steps? Well, no. Okay, then you weren't working the steps. You were playing at the steps. You weren't working the steps. Okay, so again, if you've tried it 100 times before and it hasn't worked, I would say find a sponsor who's really worked this program, who has a relationship with God, who loves this book, and do whatever she tells you. And then if someone says, well, I caused this, it's like my fault, I have it. I mean, so the book is really unclear how we get it, and they don't spend a lot of time. But let's say it's true. Let's say it's our fault, right? Let's just assume that's true. And assume that I'm taking the cell phone that I now know how to take pictures on, and I'm crossing the street looking at my cell phone, and I get hit by a truck. When the ambulance comes, because I've got now two broken legs, do I ever say, would any of us say, don't take me to the hospital? It's my fault that I got hit by the truck and got my legs broken. Just leave me here in the street. Of course we wouldn't. We would say, take me to the best surgeon there is. It's funny, but when it comes to the spiritual stuff, it's like, yeah, no, I don't want to bother God. You know what? If I break my legs, I'm going to want them to bother the best surgeon they could get that night. And for this, my spiritual malady, I'm going to bother God. The other is I've done some really bad things. We've all done things we're ashamed of. And then we can say, so did the founders of this program, and they all got better, right? That's why there's a ninth step. We get to make amends. And sometimes people just have this like vague sense of, I'm not worthy, this sense of shame. It may have been, how someone treated us when we were younger, or just like feeling, I don't deserve it. I'm not worthy. And then there's really two options. We can spend, I don't know, like $30,000 in therapy for a therapist to try to help us have, high self esteem. Probably won't work. Or I will tell you, there is nowhere in the first 164 pages of the big book, the text section, where it says worthiness is required. We're not worthy. I am not worthy. I wasn't worthy then when God picked me up, out of the gutter of self-will I was in, and I'm not worthy now for all God does for me. I don't believe he does anything because I'm worthy. So he doesn't require that we be worthy. He requires that we be willing, that we be willing to seek him, that we be willing to clean up the wreckage of our past, that we be willing to help others. And if we're willing, this great God will restore us to sanity. And next week, Melissa will tell you how to surrender to this God. And with that, I will pass.